I filled that grave 3 times in 1 week, and every morning, the earth had sunk back down, as if something underneath was trying to claw its way out. I have been a grave digger for 27 years. I have buried thousands of bodies in the cold, silent earth. I have worked through rain and snow, through scorching summer heat and freezing winter nights. I have lowered caskets containing the young and the old, the beloved and the forgotten, the peaceful and the tragic. I thought I understood death. I thought I understood graves. I thought I understood the simple, final truth that when you put a body in the ground and cover it with dirt, it stays there. Forever. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. Until I met the grave in Section E, Row 7, Plot 13. A grave that taught me that some things do not stay buried, no matter how hard you try to keep them down. This story is inspired by real accounts shared by cemetery workers and grave diggers on Reddit and various forums, where those who work among the dead whisper about experiences that no one else would believe. What I am about to tell you happened to me in the autumn of 2019, in a small cemetery in rural Pennsylvania, and I have never been the same since. My name is Walter Briggs, and I am 63 years old. I started digging graves when I was 36, after the factory where I worked shut down and left me with no job and a family to feed. My uncle had been the head groundskeeper at Hollow Creek Cemetery for decades, and he offered me work when no one else would. I took the job thinking it would be temporary, something to pay the bills until I found something better. But the years passed, and I never left. There was something about the work that suited me. The solitude, the physical labor, the strange peace that comes from working in a place where the living rarely linger. Most people think grave digging is morbid, depressing, a job for people who cannot find anything better. But I found meaning in it. I was giving families a place to grieve. I was providing the dead with their final resting place. I was part of the sacred cycle of life and death that every human being eventually faces. I took pride in my work. I treated every grave with respect, every burial with dignity. I thought that if I honored the dead, they would leave me in peace. I was wrong. Hollow Creek Cemetery sits on a hill about 3 miles outside of a small town called Ridgefield. It is one of the oldest cemeteries in the county, with some graves dating back to the early 1800s. The newer sections are well maintained, with neat rows of modern headstones and carefully trimmed grass. But the older sections, the sections we call the back acres, are different. The headstones there are weathered and cracked, many of them so old that the names and dates have worn away completely. The trees in the back acres are ancient oaks and twisted maples that block out the sunlight even in the middle of the day. The ground is uneven, sunken in places where old coffins have collapsed beneath the weight of a century's worth of soil. Most people avoid the back acres. Even the families who have ancestors buried there rarely visit. There is something about that part of the cemetery that feels different. Heavier, older, like the ground itself remembers things that the rest of the world has forgotten. It was late October when it started. The leaves had turned to gold and red, and there was a chill in the air that signaled the coming of winter. I had been asked to do some maintenance work in Section E of the back acres, clearing fallen branches, straightening headstones that had tilted over the years, filling in sunken areas where the ground had settled. It was routine work, the kind of thing I had done hundreds of times. I loaded my truck with tools and drove out to the back acres early on a Monday morning, ready for a quiet week of physical labor. I had no idea that I was about to encounter something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Section E was one of the oldest parts of the cemetery, with graves dating back to the 1850s. The headstones were a mix of styles, simple wooden markers that had rotted almost to nothing, weathered limestone tablets, and a few more elaborate monuments for the wealthier families of the era. I spent the first few hours clearing debris and making notes of which headstones needed repair. It was around noon when I first noticed Plot 13. The grave was sunken. That was not unusual. Old graves often sink as the wooden coffins beneath them collapse and decompose. What was unusual was how much it had sunk. There was a depression in the ground at least 2 feet deep, as if something had hollowed out the earth from below. I had seen sunken graves before, but nothing like this. It looked almost like a pit, a dark shadow in the ground that seemed to swallow the autumn sunlight. I made a note to fill it in and moved on with my work, thinking nothing more of it. That was my first mistake. I should have paid attention to the feeling that crept over me as I stood at the edge of that sunken grave. I should have noticed the way the air seemed colder there, the way the birds that had been singing all morning suddenly went silent. I should have trusted my instincts, which were screaming at me that something was wrong. But I ignored them. I was a professional. I had been doing this job for over 2 decades. I did not believe in ghosts or curses or restless spirits. I believed in dirt and shovels and the simple finality of death. That belief was about to be shattered. The next morning, I returned to Section E with a wheelbarrow full of soil and began filling in the sunken grave at Plot 13. The work was straightforward: shovel dirt into the depression, pack it down, repeat until the ground was level with the surrounding area. It took me about 2 hours to fill the grave completely. I tamped down the soil, raked it smooth, and stepped back to admire my work. The plot looked perfect, level and neat, indistinguishable from the graves around it. I felt a small sense of satisfaction, the quiet pride that comes from a job well done. I gathered my tools, loaded them into the truck, and drove home for the evening. I ate dinner with my wife, watched some television, and went to bed thinking about the other maintenance tasks I would tackle the next day. I slept peacefully, with no dreams that I could remember. But when I returned to Section E the next morning, I stopped dead in my tracks. The grave had sunk again. Not just a little. It had sunk all the way back down to where it had been before I filled it, maybe even deeper. The depression was at least 2.5 feet deep now, a dark pit in the earth that seemed to pulse with shadow. I stood at the edge, staring down into it, my heart beginning to pound. This was impossible. I had filled this grave yesterday. I had packed the dirt down tight. There was no way it could have settled this much overnight. Soil does not work that way. Graves do not work that way. Nothing in my 27 years of experience could explain what I was looking at. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, despite the chill in the autumn air. Something was wrong here. Something was very, very wrong. But I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was an underground spring that had washed away the soil. Maybe an animal had burrowed into the grave during the night. Maybe the old coffin had finally collapsed completely, creating a void that the new dirt had fallen into. I grasped at any explanation that did not require me to consider the impossible. I decided to fill it again, this time packing the soil even tighter, adding more dirt than before. Whatever was causing this, I would fix it. I spent the entire day filling that grave. I brought load after load of soil from the supply pile near the maintenance shed. I packed each layer down with the back of my shovel, compressing it as much as possible. I added gravel to the bottom to provide a more stable base. I did everything I could think of to make sure that dirt stayed in place. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. I stood over the filled grave, breathing heavily from the exertion, and studied my work. It looked solid, stable. There was no way it could sink again. I told myself I was being foolish, that there was nothing supernatural about a settling grave. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, gathered my tools, and headed home. That night, I did not sleep as well. I kept thinking about the grave, about the way it had looked that morning, that deep, dark pit that seemed to swallow light. I kept thinking about the cold feeling I had when I stood at its edge, the silence that seemed to surround it. I told myself I was imagining things. I was tired from the hard work. My mind was playing tricks on me. But somewhere deep inside, in a place I did not want to acknowledge, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I drove to Section E before the sun had fully risen. Part of me was hoping, praying, that I would find the grave exactly as I had left it. But as I walked through the old headstones, as I approached row 7, my hope died in my chest. The grave had sunk again, deeper than before. The depression was now at least 3 feet deep, a yawning pit in the earth that seemed to breathe with darkness. I stood at the edge, my whole body trembling, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a child. I felt true primal fear. This was not natural. This was not possible. Something was pushing that dirt out from below. Something was refusing to stay buried. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get in my truck and drive away and never come back. But I could not move. I was frozen, staring down into that pit, and that is when I saw something that turned my blood to ice. At the bottom of the depression, in the hard-packed earth that should have been undisturbed for over a century, I saw marks. Scratch marks. Long, desperate gouges in the dirt, as if something had been clawing at the soil from below. The marks were deep, carved into the earth with a ferocity that spoke of terror and desperation. They were arranged in clusters, for parallel lines close together, repeated over and over again. Fingernails. They were fingernail marks. Someone had been scratching at the underside of this grave, trying to dig their way out. But that was impossible. This grave was over 100 years old. Whatever coffin had been buried here had long since rotted away. Whatever body had been placed in it had decomposed to bones decades ago. There could not be fingernail marks in the soil. And yet there they were, fresh and deep and unmistakable, as if they had been made just hours ago. I do not remember climbing down into the grave. I do not remember making the conscious decision to investigate further. But somehow, I found myself standing at the bottom of the pit, my boots sinking into the soft earth, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The marks were everywhere. Not just at the bottom, but on the walls of the depression too, long scratches that trailed upward, as if someone had been trying to climb out. I traced one of the marks with my finger, feeling the grooves in the dirt, and I knew with absolute certainty that these had been made by human hands. I could almost feel the panic that had driven those fingers into the earth. I could almost hear the screams that must have accompanied them. And then I heard something that stopped my heart. A sound coming from below me, beneath my feet. A soft, rhythmic scratching. Scratch, 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 like fingernails on wood, like someone knocking on the lid of a coffin. I scrambled out of that pit, so fast I tore my pants on a root. I fell twice, skinning my hands on the rough earth, but I did not stop. I ran to my truck, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and I drove away from Section E without looking back. I did not stop until I reached the main office near the cemetery entrance, where my supervisor, a man named Harold Jennings, was just arriving for his shift. I must have looked like a madman, covered in dirt, pale as a ghost, babbling about scratching sounds and fingernail marks. Harold listened to my story with the patience of a man who has heard strange tales before. When I finished, he did not laugh at me or dismiss my experience. Instead, he sighed deeply, as if a weight he had long carried had suddenly grown heavier. And then he told me about Margaret Collins. Margaret Collins was buried in Plot 13 of Section E on September 3, 1891. She was 28 years old, a schoolteacher, unmarried, and by all accounts a kind and gentle soul who was beloved by the children she taught. In the summer of 1891, a cholera outbreak swept through Ridgefield, killing dozens of people in a matter of weeks. Margaret was one of them, or so everyone thought. She fell ill on August 29th, developed the characteristic symptoms of the disease, and by September 1st, she was pronounced dead by the local doctor. Given the contagious nature of cholera and the fear that gripped the community, she was buried quickly, just 2 days after her supposed death. There was no embalming, no viewing, no elaborate funeral. They put her in a simple wooden coffin, lowered her into the ground, and covered her with dirt. They thought they were protecting the living from the spread of disease. They did not realize they were burying a woman alive. Harold told me that the truth came out 3 years later, when Margaret's sister was on her deathbed and confessed what she had witnessed. She said that on the night after Margaret's burial, she had gone to the cemetery to lay flowers on her sister's grave. As she stood there in the darkness, she heard something that would haunt her until her dying day. She heard screaming, muffled, desperate screaming coming from beneath the ground. She heard pounding, frantic, rhythmic pounding, as if someone was beating their fists against the lid of a coffin. She ran to get help, but by the time she returned with the groundskeeper, the sounds had stopped. The men refused to dig up the grave, saying it was just her imagination, just the grief playing tricks on her mind. They told her that the dead could not scream. They told her to go home and pray for her sister's soul. She obeyed. She never spoke of it again until she was dying, and the guilt became too much to bear. The story spread through Ridgefield like wildfire. People demanded that Margaret's grave be exhumed, that the truth be discovered once and for all. But the town council refused. Digging up a grave was expensive and unseemly. Besides, they argued, even if Margaret had been alive when she was buried, she was certainly dead now. What good would it do to confirm everyone's worst fears? The matter was dropped. The grave was left undisturbed. And over the years, the story of Margaret Collins faded from memory, becoming just another piece of local folklore that few people took seriously. But the grave remembered. The earth remembered. And according to Harold, I was not the first groundskeeper to have problems with Plot 13. He told me that every few years, someone would be assigned to maintain Section E, and every time, they would report the same thing. The grave would sink. They would fill it. It would sink again. Some workers quit after their first encounter. Others refused to go near Section E ever again. A few, like me, tried to investigate, and what they found drove them away for good. I should have walked away. I should have handed in my resignation and found a job somewhere far from Hollow Creek Cemetery. But I could not. I kept thinking about Margaret Collins. I kept imagining what she must have experienced, waking up in total darkness, confined in a space barely larger than her own body, realizing with dawning horror that she had been buried alive. I imagined her screaming, pounding on the coffin lid, clawing at the wood until her fingernails broke and her fingers bled. I imagined the terror, the desperation, the slow suffocation as the oxygen ran out and death finally claimed her. The thought was unbearable, and the idea that she was still down there, still trying to claw her way out after more than a century, it was too much to ignore. I became obsessed. I researched catalepsy, the condition that can make a living person appear dead. I learned that before modern medicine, being buried alive was far more common than most people realize. In the Victorian era, people were so terrified of premature burial that they invented safety coffins with bells and air tubes, allowing anyone who woke up in a grave to signal for help. I learned that cholera, in particular, could cause a state so closely resembling death that even doctors were fooled. Margaret Collins was not the only victim of this terrible mistake. There were thousands like her, buried before their time, dying in the darkness beneath the earth. I went back to Section E. I do not know why. Maybe I felt I owed it to Margaret. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I was not crazy. Maybe some part of me was drawn to that grave, pulled by a force I could not understand or resist. It was a cold evening, the sun just beginning to set, when I parked my truck at the edge of the back acres and made my way to row 7. The grave had sunk again, of course. I had not filled it after my last visit, and the depression was now nearly 4 feet deep. I stood at the edge, looking down into the shadows, and I spoke aloud for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I said, "Margaret, can you hear me?" The air around me grew colder. The birds stopped singing, and from somewhere deep in the earth, I heard a sound that made my knees go weak. It was a voice, faint, distant, muffled by 100 years of dirt and stone, but unmistakably human. It was a woman's voice, and it was saying one word, over and over again. Help! I fell to my knees at the edge of that grave, tears streaming down my face. I did not know if I was crying from fear or from sorrow, but I could not stop. I said, "I hear you, Margaret. I hear you. I do not know how to help you. I do not know what to do." The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help! Please! Help!" And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I knelt there in the dirt, shaking, waiting for something else to happen. But there was only stillness. Only the cold wind rustling the dead leaves on the old oak trees. Only the growing darkness as night fell over Hollow Creek Cemetery. I stayed there until I could no longer see, until the cold had seeped into my bones and my body ached from kneeling on the hard ground. And then slowly I rose to my feet and walked back to my truck. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I went to the town library and spent the entire day researching Margaret Collins. I found her obituary in the September 1891 edition of the Ridgefield Gazette, a brief notice announcing her death from cholera and her burial at Hollow Creek Cemetery. I found records of her teaching career, mentions of her in church bulletins and community newsletters. I pieced together the life of a woman who had been kind, dedicated, loved by many. And I found one more thing, a photograph. It was a small, faded portrait, barely larger than a playing card, tucked into a folder of historical documents. Margaret Collins looked back at me with dark eyes and a gentle smile. She was pretty, with high cheekbones and curly hair pinned up in the style of the era. She looked like someone who would have been kind to children, patient with difficult students, beloved by her community. She looked like someone who did not deserve to die in terror and darkness, clawing at the lid of her own coffin. I took a copy of the photograph with me when I left the library. That night, I made a decision that I knew could cost me my job, my reputation, maybe even my freedom. I decided to dig up Margaret Collins. I waited until after midnight, when the cemetery was empty and the roads were silent. I loaded my truck with shovels, pickaxes, lanterns, and rope. I drove to Section E with my headlights off, navigating by memory through the familiar paths of the back acres. I parked as close as I could to row 7 and made my way to plot 13 on foot. The grave was waiting for me, sunken deep into the earth, darker than the shadows around it, as if it were a portal to somewhere else. Somewhere terrible. I set up my lanterns around the perimeter, took a deep breath, and began to dig. It took me 4 hours. 4 hours of backbreaking labor, of shoveling dirt and breaking through roots and stones that had been undisturbed for more than a century. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The air in the grave seemed to resist me, pressing against my chest, making every breath a struggle. My lanterns flickered constantly, as if something was trying to blow them out. More than once, I heard sounds that made me freeze. Footsteps above me, whispers in languages I did not recognize, a woman's voice crying in the darkness. But I did not stop. I could not stop. I owed it to Margaret. I owed it to myself. Finally, around 4:30 in the morning, my shovel struck something hard. Wood. Rotten, crumbling wood that fell apart at the slightest touch. I cleared away the remaining dirt with my hands, revealing the shattered remains of a coffin lid. And inside I saw her. Margaret Collins was not a skeleton. She should have been. After 128 years, there should have been nothing left but bones. But she was preserved almost perfectly like a wax figure in a museum. Her skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over her cheekbones. Her hair, still dark and curly, fanned out around her head like a halo. Her eyes were closed, her expression frozen in something that might have been peace or might have been exhaustion. And her hands, oh God, her hands. They were raised above her chest, fingers curved into claws, positioned exactly as they would have been if she had been pushing against the coffin lid. Her fingernails were gone, worn away to nothing. The tips of her fingers were ragged and torn, the bones visible through the destroyed flesh. She had clawed at that lid until there was nothing left to claw with. She had fought for her life in absolute darkness, alone and terrified, and she had lost. I do not know how long I knelt in that grave, looking at her. I do not remember crying, but my face was wet with tears. I spoke to her, though I know she could not hear me. I told her I was sorry. I told her that what happened to her was not fair, that she deserved better. I told her that I would make sure she was remembered, that her story would not be forgotten. And I told her that it was okay to rest now, that she did not have to fight anymore, that she could let go. As I spoke, something changed in the air around me. The cold began to lift. The pressure that had been pressing against my chest eased. The lanterns stopped flickering and burned steady and bright. And I could have sworn that Margaret's expression shifted. Just a tiny bit. Just enough that she no longer looked frozen. She looked peaceful. She looked, at last, at rest. I filled the grave one final time before the sun came up. But this time, I did not just dump dirt into the hole. I took my time. I placed each shovelful carefully, gently, as if I were tucking a child into bed. I packed the earth down softly, not with force but with reverence. And when I was finished, when the plot was level and smooth once more, I placed the copy of Margaret's photograph on top of the grave, held down by a small stone. I said a prayer, the first prayer I had spoken in decades, and I asked whoever was listening to let Margaret Collins rest, to let her stop fighting, to let her finally find peace. It has been 3 years since that night. The grave has never sunk again. I check on it every week, sometimes more often, and it remains exactly as I left it, level, smooth, undisturbed. I have never heard the scratching sounds again. I have never heard the voice calling for help. I believe that Margaret Collins has finally found rest. I believe that somehow, in some way I do not fully understand, she knew that someone had heard her. Someone had acknowledged her suffering. Someone had tried to help. Maybe that was all she needed. Maybe all those years of clawing and scratching and sinking the earth. Maybe she was not trying to escape. Maybe she was just trying to be heard. And now that someone has listened, she can finally sleep. I am retiring next month. 27 years is enough. I have dug my last grave, maintained my last headstone, filled my last sunken plot. But before I go, I made sure that Margaret Collins would be remembered. I worked with the local historical society to have a new headstone placed at plot 13, a beautiful granite marker that tells her story. It reads, Margaret Collins, 1863 to 1891. Beloved teacher, buried too soon. May she rest in eternal peace. Beneath that, I added one more line, a line that I hope will make visitors pause and think. It says, she was heard. Some nights, when I am lying in bed, I still think about Margaret. I think about the terror she must have felt, the desperation, the loneliness of dying in the dark. I think about the sister who heard her screaming and was not believed. I think about the generations of groundskeepers who filled that grave over and over again, never knowing the truth, never understanding what was happening beneath the soil. And I think about the strange, impossible things that exist in this world. Things that science cannot explain, things that logic cannot accept, things that only those who have experienced them can truly understand. I was a skeptic once. I believed only in what I could see and touch and measure. But Margaret Collins changed me. She taught me that some things do not obey the rules we think we understand. She taught me that death is not always the end. And she taught me that sometimes the only thing a tortured soul needs is for someone to stop and listen. If you ever visit Hollow Creek Cemetery, take a walk out to the back acres. Find Section E, Row 7, Plot 13. Stand at Margaret's grave and read her headstone. And if you feel a sudden chill, if the air seems heavier than it should, if you hear a whisper on the wind that sounds almost like a voice, do not be afraid. Just say hello. Tell her that you know her story. Tell her that she is not forgotten. And tell her that she is heard. I believe she would like that. I believe, after all these years, that is all she ever wanted. What would you do if you discovered something in the earth that defied all explanation? Would you run away, or would you dig deeper to uncover the truth? I made my choice on a cold October night, and I have never regretted it. Margaret Collins deserved to be heard. And now, at last, she has been. But sometimes I wonder, how many others are still down there, in cemeteries all over the world, waiting for someone to notice that their graves will not stay filled? How many voices are crying out in the darkness, hoping that someone, someday, will finally listen? The thought keeps me awake at night, and I suspect, after hearing my story, it might keep you awake too.